started. Welcome. My name is Christina Corral. I am one of the directors of the North Central Region Water Network. I actually am in Michigan. I work for Michigan State University Extension, along with my colleague Paul Gross, who's a director, Leslie Johnson, who's from the University of Nebraska, and Nardi, who is from University of Wisconsin, and Brian Doherty, who's from Iowa State. We're directors of the Soil Health Nexus, and we are a university-led team, and we're dedicated to increase and access to research-based soil health knowledge, extension, and resources. We do represent all the land grants in the 12 North Central Region states, along with other representatives from our state and federal government counterparts. So what's going to happen today is we're going to have a presentation, and we're going, at the end of the presentation, we're going to have a time of question and answers, and then we're going to break out in different rooms on researchers, educators, agencies, farmers, and students. And at the end, when it's time for the breakout rooms, you'll just decide which one you want to go to, and then we'll go from there. So this week, Dr. Randy Jackson from University of Wisconsin is going to talk to us about the climate smart agriculture for the North Central U.S. You want to take it away from there, Randy? I will stop sharing, and you can start.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll get my screens situated here a little bit. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm excited to talk to you about some of the work that has been going on in Wisconsin in particular. And so I think it's great that we'll have I hope to leave an opportunity for a lot of Q&A and discussion afterwards, because I think some of the things we'll talk about maybe are a little bit provocative and controversial. But before I get into it, let me just acknowledge Josh Posner here, who is an agronomy professor at UW-Madison. He passed away about 7 or 8 years ago now. He had the foresight to establish this thing we call the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial, WICST, in 1989, and it exists still today. Thank you to Janet Hedke, who worked with Josh for many years to maintain the experiment, which is about I think it has about a 30-acre footprint, and at least 9 different cropping systems in this experiment, in this long-term experiment. Greg Sanford was Josh's PhD student and continues to work with us and really manages and oversees the trial, and by most accounts the lead scientist on the project. So I just want to make sure that I point out that much of the work here is Dr. Sanford's, but we all stand on each other's shoulders. So climate smart agriculture, of course, is a hot topic. The USDA has just made available $1,000 million to help stand up climate smart commodities. This call for proposals just came out last week, and so lots of people are elbowing and jockeying for position to triangulate and get in line for this sort of thing. But I think it's super important for us to really interrogate what do we mean by climate smart. Of course, the USDA was pretty prescriptive in this call. They basically listed practices, and there's an ongoing debate, I think a pretty healthy debate, but I think we need to maybe stop debating and figure it out and think about whether we should be more focused on outcomes than practices. And, we can, like I say, we can talk more about that. Let's just take a brief second to remind ourselves why we care about climate smart agriculture. The big picture is the atmospheric carbon concentration is increasing on average 4 petagrams of carbon per year. I don't know what a petagram is, so I drew it up here, or translated it up here. It's a quadrillion grams of carbon. 9 of those are coming from fossil fuel combustion and cement production and land use change. And of course, we've also stimulated uptake of carbon by stimulating photosynthesis in the oceans and on land to the tune of about 5 petagrams. And so that's where we get our carbon imbalance, if you will, of 4 petagrams of carbon per year increasing in the atmosphere. And so there's, of course, tremendous interest in figuring out how to get it into the soil and how to keep it in the soil. And that all is another point of discussion. It's one thing to accumulate carbon and another to keep it there. Uh, some folks have been intrepid enough to ask, what does that really mean? So Harden et al. In 2017 published this, looking at potential changes in carbon stocks of soils, I guess, and biomass in various land use kind of types around the globe, looking at the amount of acreage in these types, and then also their capacity maybe to actually increase the amount of carbon. And you can see if you squint hard enough at these three bars on the left that you're getting up around that nut of 4 petagrams of carbon per year, if you do a really good job at all three of these. On the other hand, working against us is the melting permafrost that's putting more and more carbon in the atmosphere, and of course ongoing biomass clearing in the tropics and other land uses that are liberating carbon and putting it in the atmosphere. So that's all well and good, but I'm always wondering, like, what does that really mean? What does it look like? Can you make it real? And so I've tried to do that here with this. Here's Greg. I should say that if you look at these numbers of 2 to, let's see, what is it for crops? About a half, and for grazing about 1.5. The numbers here for the cropping systems world is somewhere between 10 and 70 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And so here I've tried to draw what I think is, like, at a really rough scale, a meter squared behind Greg. And here Greg is holding in his hand what looks to me to be about 20 grams of soil. And so if we give it a liberal estimate of carbon, that's 2.5% carbon in his hand. I'm sorry, that's 2.5% carbon. Let me restate this, 2.5% of that 20 grams is carbon, which means he has about 0.5 gram of carbon in his hand. And so if we're trying to crack this nut up here of 10 to 70 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, we're talking about 20 to 140 handfuls of soil, like that one in his hand, spread onto a meter squared every year. So it's a significant amount of soil and carbon accumulation. And some background soil formation estimates are in the range of 1 to 5 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So I just like to get a little context and a little, like, what does it really mean, on the ground. Of course, building carbon in ecosystems, whether they're agricultural ecosystems or not, is kind of a daunting business. It's precarious business, let's say. This is great work from Howard Skinner's group in Pennsylvania back in 2008, but I love it so much that I always come back to it. It's net ecosystem exchange of carbon using an ecovariance system, and continuously monitoring the carbon balance of these systems. And so you've got alfalfa. Don't really care about the distinction between the alfalfa and the grass. I'm just trying to get the main outlines here. So these circles up here are grass and alfalfa, and that's these upper lines, and that's of course the net gain of carbon to the agroecosystem throughout the year. And then the red line here is sort of the average net losses of carbon by microbial or heterotrophic respiration throughout the year. And of course the carbon balance, the net carbon balance of the system, is the difference between these two. And so what's, I think, striking is the relatively short part of the year, the short number of months, the few number of months that the system is actually accruing carbon at all, not to say anything about whether or not it's actually getting stored and sequestered in the soil. The positive balance really is only happening during the spring green up here. If you squint hard enough, maybe there's a little bit happening in October. And of course, this varies dramatically from year to year. But you can imagine that anything that we do to sort of upset MPP during this growth phase, like maybe harvesting hay, can really undermine the potential for the system to accumulate carbon at all. So we have this cartoon about what is carbon sequestration. If we look at the soil organic matter, I'm sure I'm lecturing to the choir here, so forgive me if I am. We've got carbon dioxide coming in as MPP and accumulating as that MPP dies, as that biomass dies in a pool of particulate or organic matter. If we look under the scope, you'd still see plant cells. And of course, microbes are trying to get that carbon. They're heterotrophs. They can't get it out of the atmosphere. So they're building their own biomass to make their living. And they're turning over and sloughing and dying. And so their cells are accumulating as necromass, microbial necromass in the soil. And we like necromass because it's gooey and sticky and tends to stick around in the soil and glom onto silt clay particles, in particular in what we call mineral associated organic matter. And so for shorthand, I think it's fair to say that most people consider the mayom the sort of stabilized pool of carbon in the soil, whereas the particular organic matter, which is a very important pool of carbon, is more labile or readily liberated off to the atmosphere as CO2. Here, my grad student Ashley took some photos of separations of POM and mayom, just physical separation with a sieve. And of course, that carbon, there's a cost of building that microbial biomass and accessing that microbial biomass. That's heterotrophic respiration, where we've got CO2 coming off. So it's really the difference between these systems like we talked about a minute ago, but then there's important mechanisms happening below ground that are driving whether or not that mayom pool is actually accumulating and therefore stabilizing carbon. Oops, lost my slides here, but that's okay. This was supposed to be a picture showing you that the mayom pool tends to saturate when we look at mayom globally, whereas POM doesn't. So the POM pool is very important because we can continue to build it, whereas the mayom pool seems to have a finite capacity to accumulate. Okay, so let me walk through what we see as 4 big challenges with estimating the carbon balance of agroecosystems. And one is that not everything that should be included in the carbon balance of the agroecosystem is included. And so I'm apologize for picking on one study, but it's not alone. There are a lot of studies in the literature that are pointing to the carbon balance of a cropping system without including anything about the change in soil carbon, which can give you some pretty misleading numbers like this one, which is looking at the net C gain of the agroecosystem as these tan bars that are going negative here. And so without the loss of carbon from the soil, this can be really misleading. And you can see here that those gains are overwhelming all of the carbon losses to the atmosphere through machinery use and fossil fuel use and fertilizers, et cetera. And so the takeaway message from the study was that carbon was accumulating in the system. And of course, there's no way of knowing whether it is because they're only looking at the gains with respect to the actual plant communities. Second issue that is rife through the literature, and I've contributed to this, my students have contributed to this. I might even show you some data from a story like this, but we have to just be very scrutinizing of papers that use space for time substitutions. And John Sanderman and his and Baldock demonstrated this back in 2010 that why we have to be cautious about that. And it's mainly related to where we might be on some overall trajectory of soil carbon, when we do some sort of intervention, like improved management, so-called improved management. And depending where we're at can really affect the interpretation. Where our starting point is, where our baseline is, can really affect the interpretation. And so if you don't have a baseline measurement and you're not actually looking at change over time, if all you have are these pairs, your interpretation from comparing these two treatments would be that there was carbon loss and carbon loss. And the interpretation here might be that carbon's stable and that carbon was lost in the conventional management. And of course, down here in this scenario, maybe the conventional management is stable, but the improved management is increasing. So it's just to say that when we look at space for time substitution type studies, we have to be very careful. Similarly, if we're not looking at the entire soil depth, we can be misled. Here's an example from our own work where we, just for comparison, are looking at pastures, forages, and grain crops. And you can see here, we might assess that the change over a 20-year period was a gain in the pastures, no change in the forage, and a loss in the grain if we just look at the 0 to 15 centimeter depth. But when we look across the entire 90 centimeters, no significant gain or loss in the pasture, no change, and then losses in the forages and the grains. And so if we're basing policy on an agroecosystem gaining carbon, but it's based on studies that are primarily focused on surface horizons, that could be leading us down the wrong path. Finally, there are challenges with estimating soil carbon change if we don't use what's known as the equivalent soil mass method. And that basically is just what happens when we get significant soil compaction. So here's an example where we're looking at the soil from the side and it's been compacted, say 2 centimeters over time, but we still take a 0 to 10 centimeter core. The number of red dots in these two cores is the same. In other words, the concentration is the same of soil carbon compared to mineral soil. That's the concentration of soil carbon in there. We might conclude that this one on the left has 2 grams of carbon per centimeter squared, but because things have been compacted and we take basically sample a deeper increment, we would conclude that we've gained 0.4 grams of carbon per centimeter squared. So Adam Von Hayden, who's working as a postdoc with us now, published a piece that has walked through an R script and a justification for using this equivalent soil mass approach. Okay, so lots of methodological challenges with doing soil carbon work. I didn't even mention how notoriously variable in time and space carbon is in the soil. And so we've got to really bludgeon the system with samples to try and constrain that variation. Let me transition here to talking about some work that came out of the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial, which I mentioned Josh started back in 1989. I'm just going to talk about these 6 cropping systems. There are also some prairie grass treatments that we have as part of the trial, but I'm not going to talk about those today. It's in southern Wisconsin at the Arlington Ag Research Station. These are mollisols, prairie derived, about 1 meter deep, and incredibly productive soil, silt loams, and very, very productive with respect to annual grain crops. So we have 3 cash grain systems: conventional corn and beans in rotation, and then an organic system that's a corn, soybean, wheat cover crops, followed by clover for some nitrogen before we go back into corn. That's an organically managed cash grain crop. So these are managed with the best genetics every year. These 2 on the left are managed with the best genetics and high inputs, herbicides, Roundup, etc. And then 3 dairy forage rotations that are typical of Wisconsin. So the corn alfalfa is sort of a typical corn with 3 years of alfalfa, an organic corn with oat cover crops going into 2 years of alfalfa, organically managed. And then a cool season pasture that's rotationally grazed with dairy heifers. I don't know if Josh was thinking about this when he developed this experiment, but they kind of array along 2 gradients, one of diversity and one of perenniality. Things are getting more perennial and moving down and more diverse as we move to the right. Importantly, there's 4 reps of every phase of the rotations every year, which makes for like 76 plots that we're, that Greg and team are scrambling around to manage every year. So for Greg's PhD work, he looked at 1 meter deep cores in 2009 and looked back at the 1989 cores. And so he had a 20-year comparison of those 1 meter deep cores. And this is the takeaway results from his dissertation work. You don't have to stare at this very long to see that all of the cropping systems over a 20-year period across the full soil horizon were losing a significant amount of carbon, or had lost a significant amount of carbon, on the order of 25 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. Remember, for context, that we're trying to gain 10 to 70 grams of carbon per meter squared per year to try and fight climate change. So obviously we're in the wrong direction here. These systems were all sources of carbon to the atmosphere. Again, this is just the change in the soil. It doesn't bring into play any fossil fuel use or the life cycle analysis sort of things. Interestingly, the pasture was not significantly different. It was numerically had increased, but it was the variation was such that it hadn't significantly increased. We have a grad student now, Claire Dietz, who's got our 2019 data in her hands. We're anxiously anticipating her results. She hasn't shared them with us yet because she knows that once she does, I'll just start running around talking about them. And I need to let her see that through, but we're very excited about that 30-year increment. I think I can say safely, though, from scoping the data with her, that we're going to probably sort of double down on this story. The pastures are looking quite good compared to the other systems. In addition to that, those losses, or maybe partially driving those losses, Janet Hedke, who I mentioned earlier, ran Russell 2 for these systems to look at soil loss prediction, in tons per acre. And I then use those numbers to calculate what those tons per acre numbers would mean in terms of the amount of carbon lost from those systems. And so you can see that if we were at the tolerable soil loss of 5 tons of carbon per acre, that would be about 31 grams of carbon per meter squared, which is, right in the same ballpark as what we observed we were losing. I don't think we were losing those 25 grams of carbon because of erosion exclusively, but it's a pretty flat site. There is some topography. I'm sure there was a lot of carbon moving around and being redistributed within our plots. But you can see the organic systems don't fare too well, according to Russell 2, with the constant soil disturbance as we try to manage weeds without fossil fuels, and with a lot of soil disturbance. And then, of course, the pasture losing, it was less than 1 gram of carbon per meter squared, again, right around the amount that we might assume the system is gaining as a result of just soil building. So that's a story from Wixt. I want to transition to some work that my grad student, Ashley Becker, who's just finished her master's and is now going on for a PhD. She went and did more of if Wixt is an intensive looking at it over time sort of experiment. She went out to over 30 sites in southern Wisconsin, all of them that had pastures, and then used a long list. She actually contacted over 50 farmers to begin with and did some sifting and winnowing to converge on 30 or so sites where a pasture existed. It was older than 3 years, and they had some sort of neighboring paired site that was in an annual crop of some kind, any kind of crop. And the criteria were, what we asked the farmers to do was identify that it was the previous management of the pasture, as far as they knew, that it was on the same soil type, that it was on similar slope, et cetera, et cetera. And so Ashley really did her due diligence on this to make sure that she had a good paired comparisons. So she had 30 or so of these comparisons. And she only looked at the surface horizons, the 15 centimeters and the 15 to 30 centimeters. And you don't have to stare at this or squint at this to see that in the surface horizon, there was a lot more carbon in the pastures compared to the crop fields, the row crop fields, on the order of almost 12 megagrams per hectare, 12 tons per hectare. Interestingly, no change from the 15 to 30 centimeter comparison. Maybe this speaks to, there were good pairings to begin with. They were similar soils to begin with. And that's certainly some of the hay that we made in this publication that's coming out any minute in the Soil Science Society of America journal. And then transitioning now back to Wixt, but some work that Matt Ruark and postdoc extraordinaire Yi Chao Rui have taken on and just published a week and a half or so ago in PNAS. really trying to get at some of the mechanisms behind why we saw what we saw with Greg's work. And so Yu Chao went to Great Lakes to estimate microbial carbon use efficiency, which is to say how much biomass are the microbes building in their bodies per unit carbon accessed. How efficient are they at building their bodies? You can see that in the pastures, these green bar, it's upwards of 44% of the carbon that they're accessing, they're turning into their own biomass and not respiring, at least not respiring immediately. And it's a much lower value for these other cropping systems, whether it's continuous corn or the organic systems. The corn alfalfa system was somewhere in between. Likewise, when Yu Chao looked at the amount of microbial necromass assayed as the amino sugars that have accumulated in the soil, these are sugars that are specific to bacterial bodies, cell walls. You can see that there was more necromass accumulating in the pastures, maybe not significantly more than where it was accumulating in the organic alfalfa, but nonetheless more in the pastures and in the perennial systems. When he looked at that necromass and related it to the amount of mineral associated organic matter, that so-called stabilized pool of carbon, you can see there's a direct positive relationship. And in fact, more of that stabilized carbon accumulating as Mayom see in the pastures compared to the other systems. So the next step here, we've got a couple or three students who are digging into this even further. Yu Chao has loads more data, and so we're digging into those to explore further what the mechanisms are for this. Is it something about the microbial communities? Are the communities themselves shifting? Is it just their physiology responding to different inputs? Is it something about the root inputs, et cetera, et cetera? Very exciting work. Okay, shifting gears one more time, and this will be my last story. This is work that was just published last week and in Agricultural and Environmental Letters. Started out as Randy doodling on the back of an envelope, and that's really what the analysis is. I worked hard to make it more than just doodling on an envelope, but let me just be clear, it's not life cycle analysis. It's not a proper life cycle analysis. But you know, I get the question all the time from folks. If we were raising our cattle on grass, would that be better with respect to climate change, or would it be worse? You know, and you hear all kinds of stuff, and there's lots of stuff in the literature. One of the things that's really been really frustrating for me is that the stuff in the literature is mostly using a denominator term for their assessment that is per unit of product produced, you know, because efficiency is always sort of the main driver, yield and efficiency. And so you can always make that system look better if you're producing more and squeezing more out of the system. But, you know, we're not interested in a relative reduction of a relative mitigation of climate change. We need a real mitigation of climate change. We need to actually put less carbon into the atmosphere overall. And so I was really interested to put these sort of carbon balance stuff on a land basis. So the question was set up with, you can see that I just kind of copied and pasted from the article, the sections of the paper. The grain-fed beef finishing system is devastating to ecosystem health, whether it's soil health or water quality or water quantity with flooding or biodiversity or rural communities, on and on and on. And I'm not going to load up on it anymore here other than to say it's a devastating system. And, you know, we can go and start talking about health too. It's quite pretty clearly been linked to some devastating soil health, not soil health, human health outcomes. Nonetheless, we grow out of the 137 million hectares of ag land in the US, about 41 million hectares of corn, of maize. And we feed it to livestock, 39% of it, that changes a lot. About 27% of it we turn into ethanol. We use it for food additives so that we can have groceries that sit on the shelf for a long time and taste good. Some people don't think it tastes good. Sometimes it tastes good. And then of course we export a lot of it. And I think it's really important to note that the exports are mainly purchasing that grain, and shipped to relatively affluent countries. And then of course there's a big fraction of it that's stored as surplus, whatever that means. It accumulates and is kept in some reserve. About close to 5 million hectares of the maize that's grown is used to fatten beef cattle in feedlots in the Great Plains, and that results in slaughter rates of about 22 million head of beef cattle per year, which is about 5.4 billion kilograms or 13 billion pounds of beef every year in the grain finished system. We know that well-managed grazed perennial grasslands can enhance ecosystem health, can help build soil carbon, can help clean up the water, can help support biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question becomes, yeah, but is there sufficient land to produce that 13 billion pounds, 5.4 billion kilograms of beef every year? Is there enough land? And there's been a lot of papers that have concluded, no, there's not enough land. And the thing that was irksome to me, let's say, is that those analyses almost always ask, is there enough existing pasture land now to finish on grass all of these livestock? And the answer to that is no, there isn't enough existing pasture. But if we were going to do that, we wouldn't need a lot of the corn that we're producing. And so I really wanted to ask, what if we took that corn land that's feeding cows and feedlots and put it in grassland and put the animals out on it and finish them on grass? All right, so hang with me here. The feedlot system, as I've already mentioned, is 13 billion pounds of beef each year. It's about 13 million head. If we had them all on grass, they would finish slower and they would take longer to finish. So we would need more animals. We would need 20 million head to make the same amount of beef. Now, all this presupposes that we should just keep eating the same amount of beef. I think we probably should eat less beef, but everybody has their opinion. Everybody has their taste. The question here is, can we keep producing what we produce now? We would need about 20 million head, so a lot more animals. If we took all the corn land that converted it to grassland, that's very productive land. Planted to grass, we could finish 1 to 2 head per acre per year. Some have argued, well, maybe it's more like 3, but the next point is sort of trumps that in that there's 12 million acres of corn land currently feeding beef and feedlots. So we could finish 12 to 24 million head per year. Of course, we're trying to crack this nut of 20 million head. So, depending on how productive the land is, we get close. And if we need more land, we can take some of the 30 million acres or 27 million acres that's growing it for ethanol, which colleagues Tyler Lark and Chris Kucharik et al. Published in PNAS in the same issue, is devastating to our ecosystem health and a net energy loss. We need to stop doing that. So if we took that 30 million acres of corn that's going to ethanol and threw in 20 million acres of land that's in CRP that desperately needs some grazing to maintain it as grassland, and add it to the 12 million acres of corn that's growing grain for feedlots, there's more than enough land to produce beef on grassland in the US. But the question always goes, what about the carbon footprint of those increasing cattle numbers? And this is a big but. This is an important but. So this is the back of the envelope stuff that I worked through. And so here's scenario A, which is the current system, the grain finished feedlot beef. And I just came up with rate estimates for these are like the big ones, there's probably others. We could argue about whether I got everything here, but I got the biggies. The enteric methane from the animals, the estimate is about 59 kilograms of methane per cow per year. That turns out to be about 20 megatons of CO2 equivalents. Who knows what that means? The EPA has this cool calculator. Here's a link to it down here. that allows you to translate that into the number of coal-fired power plants. And so you can see that enteric methane production from our current beef production system is about equivalent to 5 coal-fired power plants. For context, the US currently has 241 coal-fired power plants, and Wisconsin has 7. I think one's going offline next year, so we'll have 6. Just good context. I think China has, shoot, I lost track of the number. I think it's something like 1,200 coal-fired power plants. Okay, soil nitrous oxide is a big carbon loss, if you will, carbon equivalent loss. About 7 coal-fired power plants. Oh, I think I misspoke earlier when I said the whole system. I didn't say the whole system, I said methane. Anyway, turns out if you add all these up, the whole system of our current beef production is close to 16 coal-fired power plants sourced to the atmosphere. Now, what's important here is that for the soil carbon balance, I put in an estimate of 250. Remember, Greg's work from Wix was showing about 250 kilograms of carbon per hectare per year was going off. And I think I listed it as 25 grams per meter squared, but it's 250 kilograms per hectare. So that's, that system is a carbon source to the atmosphere, taken in along with all these other sources. It's a big carbon source to the atmosphere. All right, so that same land put into grassland and finished for beef. Yeah, those animals, I think we need more work here, but there's some good work that shows that they're going to be producing more methane on a exclusively forage diet. And so this is the best estimate I could come up with here, closer to 77 kilograms per cow per year. That translates over here to about 10 coal-fired power plants. So you can see that, yeah, adding those cows on grass is going to increase the enteric methane emissions. But the nitrous oxide emissions from the soil are quite a bit less. Trying to remember why these numbers are the same. It's because why that 7.5 and 7.2 are the same. I might have to come back to that. Anyway, you can see here that we're not losing carbon from soil erosion, or very little, industrial infixation, fossil fuel use, heavy equipment use, etc. What I did put in down here was wetland methane emissions. And one can imagine that there were more wetlands, there'd be more wetlands in that grassland, and they'd be emitting a significant amount of methane. Anyway, the grand total here was close to 19 compared to 16. So the system would really be close to a 1-for-1 swap. You'd be adding a couple of coal-fired power plants. That's important. I'm not trying to trivialize it, but it's not like order of magnitude differences. And that's what I mean by back of the envelope. Not to mention that we would be getting clean water and biodiversity and reducing flooding and, maybe stimulating some rural communities with more diverse systems, et cetera. So there would be a lot of attendant benefits. We might be having a swap in terms of carbon, but just because it was fun, I kept going, and I said, what if we took that same land and put it back into tallgrass prairie with bison grazing it? And I'm not going to walk through all these numbers, but assuming that the soil carbon was actually gaining in that system and that soil erosion was negative, in other words, we were building soil, et cetera, but there's still methane emissions from the wetlands. That system is emitting about 10 coal-fired power plants worth of carbon every year. Just for context, again, like, what are we trying to get here? A landscape that is net zero? That's going to be pretty tricky, given that the original tallgrass prairie was probably not net zero. Anyway, one more bit on this and then I'll be done. What's really critical here is the soil carbon balance line. And so I made a little more hay out of that in the paper. And soil carbon balance is, of course, the wild card. That's why there's so much interest in it. So many people doing so many studies. Here I took the grain finished and the grass finished systems, and I basically just did like kind of a sensitivity analysis to see how things would change. Here's what I used for that last analysis: 15.9 coal-fired power plants based on Greg's work. Some good work from Iowa State and other places doing reviews of cover crops and no-till. You know, we might reduce carbon emissions, something like 14 coal-fired power plants instead of 16, and we might gain another coal-fired power plant with no-till. Here, I just use I solved for how much soil carbon change would we need to make the current system a net zero, and this number is pretty ridiculous to think that we would actually gain that much carbon in an annual cropping system, but thought it was important to show what we might be able to get. Okay, and then here's the grass system I used, of course, a value of 0 based on Greg's work, which put us at about 19 coal-fired power plants. Ashley's work, which again is just focused on the surface horizons, I plugged that in and that reduces it to about 15. And Alan Franz Luber's has done some work that if his soil carbon accumulation estimates are right, then we're closer to 9. And if we get up here around 1,600 kilograms per hectare per year, which translates to 1.5 tons per acre per year, then we're net zero with our grazing system. And then, of course, there's been some work that's shown some incredibly high accumulation of soil carbon. Paige Stanley's work from Michigan and Jason Roundtree's work has shown some numbers that are more like this. And down in the southeast part of the US, there's been some really astronomical numbers. The reviewers wouldn't let me keep them in, so we can talk about that, upwards of 8 megagrams per hectare per year. So it's really important that we understand whether or not the systems are soil carbon positive or soil carbon negative, because it really drives what's going on with the overall carbon balance of the system. I think I've said everything that's on this slide. These are the core ideas from that paper. And of course, the main conclusion or the discussion point of that paper is this is there for us if we want to do it. We as a collective people, as a society, we shape the agricultural system right now with policies. We support and prop up the current system. We could support and prop up another system that would give us clean water and biodiversity and possibly help stabilize the climate and still produce the same amount of meat and not displace other crop production. We just need courageous policymaking to make it happen. That's all, just courageous policymaking. Okay, so let me just wrap up. Our annual cropping systems are losing soil carbon, but the pastures we're maintaining it. Be wary of all these methodological issues. If we just look at the surface soils, if we just do space for time, if we don't account for equivalent soil mass, if we don't do a full accounting, we can come up with some erroneous conclusions. Systems that gain carbon must continuously cover the soil, eliminate soil, all these soil health things that you all know about. But basically it means grassland. Cover crops here and there, no-till here and there, they're improvements, but as I like to say, they make a bad system a little bit better as opposed to making a system good. Okay, I've tried to provoke and get some conversation stimulated, so let me end and thank you for indulging me.
All right, thank you, Randy. Just have a couple of questions that have come in the chat box. The first one is from Mark, and he asked, the Russell 2 estimates don't fit the actual measurement of soil organic carbon in organic versus conventional cropland. Any thoughts?
Sorry, Christina, you kind of broke up a little bit. Can you just repeat it? Or I guess I can turn on the chat with myself.
Yeah, and it's from Mark. His statement is the Russell 2 estimates don't fit the actual measurements of soil organic carbon in organic versus conventional cropland. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I'm not an expert on Russell 2, so I don't have any thoughts. I mean, I guess I hadn't really thought about how they compared, to be honest. I need to go back and stare at those, so thank you for pointing that out. I guess if maybe, Mark, you mean they don't match in terms of the direction or the sign. I think I'd have to be staring at the figures here to understand the question a little bit better. Mark, do you mind? Is he allowed to pop on and ask?
Yeah, he can pop on. Mark, if you want to chime in, you can unmute yourself. Well, I don't know if he's still with us. I haven't looked.
Okay. Right.
So we can go on to the next one, and it's another Russell 2 question from Justin. And this is maybe to explain Mark's a little bit. Is Russell 2 designed for measuring actual soil loss from a field or soil movement within a field? If Russell 2 was only calculating soil particle movement and showing 5 tons per acre within a field, but only half ton of soil is actually lost in runoff, as an example, to an accurate way to measure soil carbon loss from a field.
Yeah. So I think these questions point out, I think it's important to point out that I wasn't using Russell 2 to estimate how much carbon was being lost. I was just trying to get my head around, like, if as much soil was being lost as Russell 2 was predicting was possible, you know, how much carbon would that be? But these thoughts are important because I need to think about the way I present that and talk about it for sure.
I'll go on to your studies. That might be easier. This is from Kathleen. Is a study comparing a 1989 to 2009 soil carbon, our single measurements in 2 years, 20 years apart, reliable to determine loss of carbon over time? Would it not be more reliable to measure constantly each year for 20 years? And is there any intervening years of measurement?
That's a good question. There are intervening years, but they're only in the surface layers. And so we do have those data to kind of fill in and look at the interannual variability. As most folks know, looking at interannual variability in soil organic carbon is not very gratifying because you've got so much noise and bouncing around. The fact that we were able to see the clear loss of carbon, you know, with respect to air bars, and the clear sort of no significant change in carbon in the pasture, and the separation of the treatments, I think was gratifying because, you know, you're just actually looking at what's changed over 20 years. So, and I will say we've done, like, EHL's work and subsequent measurements have independent, if you will, measurements of the same systems have converged on the same findings that the pastures are holding on to, if not accumulating carbon in the surface.
Thank you. This is just a statement from Scott looking at adding more and more grazing, that we need to remember that we're going to have to also look at water supplies and provide livestock water supplies and conversion of corn to grassland to avoid streams.
Yeah.
So I got to remember the water.
Yeah, but and in addition, we would be slowing down hydrology and recharging aquifers to a higher rate and improving water quality if we manage well. That's a key thing too about grazing, is it's not a panacea. You can't just throw it out there and graze any old way. That has to be well managed rotational grazing that improves the productivity of the system to hold on to the nutrients. Beat down old pastures, lose nutrients, just like grain systems. Emily
Is asking, is the carbon footprint table assuming that grass finished beef is raised on cool season pastures? And if so, why such a big difference between pasture versus tall grass pastures? Prairies, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the assumption is that they were cool season pastures, although there's nothing specific in the calculations that sort of differentiate that, other than the soil carbon change estimates. And so I think the main difference is that the soil carbon change in the grass finished pastures that I assigned was 0 based on our work at Wixt, whereas in the prairie I assigned a gain of 100 kilograms per hectare per year. You know, our prairies, would prairies actually be gaining that now? That's an open question. We have a lot of thoughts about why are we losing carbon at depth, because that was an observation that I didn't talk much about here. This could be a signal of a changing climate already, where things are getting warmer in the winter and warmer in the nighttime. And as a result, we have microbial respiration burning off deep soil carbon during periods of time when there's no NPP. Would that be happening if it was warm season prairie grasses that had deeper roots? That's an open question, but one that we're keen to get at. I guess the other big difference is that we do get a significant amount of nitrous oxide emissions from the grazed pasture because the animals are mineralizing nitrogen and making it available for microbial denitrification. And you're getting some of that with the bison, but the density of the bison is much lower than you would get with a managed grazing system. Good question.
Charles asked on the bison question, is there less meat in your bison or buffalo scenario?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I didn't even think about it. I just thought about the bison being out there generating methane. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
The number of bison that I estimated was on that same land, about 13 million bison. And those numbers came from a study by Alan Knapp back in 1999, sort of like estimated density of bison pre-European. And yeah, that's a good question. I didn't do the meat stuff for the bison.
I'm going to just do one more question. There's a couple on there, like in carbon markets. Check our archives and the Nexus, because we've had some cafes on that in the past. This last one we're going to do before we break out for a couple minutes is from Allie, and she's asking, in the corn and grass-finished beef systems in northern climates, the need for cultivated crop or hay is still necessary once pastures are no longer producing in the winter months. How much better, if it is at all, is it to rely on harvesting hay as a feed supplement rather than an annual grain? Yeah,
great question, Allie. And that's one of the next things that I'm going to sharpen my pencil and get at, because there's nothing about seasonality in here. And that, of course, is a big oversimplification of the system, especially the farther north you go. A lot of graziers this far north are feeding hay on pastures in a rotational way to redistribute nutrients and that sort of thing. And so the management, the way the hay is managed and fed out, I think is critical to maintaining the carbon balance. If you're just harvesting hay year after year, the data are pretty clear. It's very unlikely that you're accumulating carbon because you're exporting so much from the system and not returning the nutrients. Of course, if you bring the manure back, that can change things. But if you're feeding that hay back out on those pastures and the livestock are recycling those nutrients and carbon, then there's some possibility that you're maintaining the benefits. Yeah, but it's a great question in the next study.
Right. Thank you, Randy. Thank you for joining us today. Remember, next month we'll be back on our normal schedule. We'll be meeting on March 16th. Topic is to be determined yet. We have a couple people we've asked, so we will let you know when that is. And then in a minute, we're going to go into our breakout rooms. If you can spare the time to be with us, we would love it. This is just some of the questions that we'd like you to go ahead and discuss in our breakout rooms. So with that, Anne, you want to put us all in our breakouts, and thank you for